Welcome. On this video, we're going to have a small introduction into logic. So in mathematics, we have used variables as placeholders. And usually those placeholders were for values. Here are some examples. The variable x, it's a placeholder for a value of 5. The variable y, it's a placeholder for a value of 10. The variable z, it's a placeholder for a value of 25, and so forth. But when we deal with logic, we have to also understand that we can also use variables to represent sentences or full statements. So now the next question is, how does this actually look like? How can a variable represent a full statement? Well, for that, let's introduce some vocabulary words that we're going to be using throughout this lesson. The first idea that we're going to be discussing in terms of logic is this idea of compound statements. The way that we're going to be defining compound statements is a compound statement is whenever we combine two statements. Let's give an example. Today is Monday, and tomorrow is Tuesday. Let's say you're thirsty and you say, well, I'm thirsty and I'm going to drink my water or drink my juice. Notice that within these two examples, there's always two statements put together to combine a new statement. So in our first example here, my first statement is today is Monday. And my second is tomorrow is Wednesday. So there were two statements that were put together. That's what we refer to as a compound statement. In my second example here, my first statement was drink my water. My second statement was drink my juice. And they were put together to have a new statement, drink my water or drink my juice. Notice that those two statements were put together by either using the word and or either using the word or. Well, for that, we actually have a more specific term whenever we glue two statements together by either using and or. And for that, we need to define what a conjunction statement is. A conjunction statement is whenever we combine two statements using the word and. And we actually have a symbol for that. A symbol that we are going to be using for conjunction statements is this upper arrow. But why do we even need symbols if we can just write it out in words? Well, for that, let's consider these two statements that we have here. One statement is Ines plays the flute, and the second statement is Zoo plays the cello. Now, how would a conjunction statement would look like for these two statements? Well, it will definitely look like Ines plays the flute and Sue plays the cello. Let me actually separate this a little bit more. Plays the cello. Thinking back to what we said at the starting of this lesson, we said that now we can use variables as placeholders for full statements or sentences, notice that in here, I'm going to define just the letter P to represent the statement Inez plays the flute. And in here, I'm going to let Q define the statement Sue plays the cello. So now, using this symbol and knowing that I can use variables as placeholders, I can represent this statement the following way. Inez plays the flute. I can just represent that with a letter P. The word and, we can use this placeholder, upper arrow, and Q represents the statement Sue plays the cello. So now what we have here, it's a symbolic way of representing the statement Inez plays the flute and Sue plays the cello. And we need to get comfortable with this. Anytime that you see any kind of a statement where we have this upper arrow statement, you have to identify what does the statement on the left represent, which in this case is Inez plays the flute. And you also have to try to understand what does the right-hand side statement represents, which in this case is Sue plays the cello. Because notice that once we get a hang out of representing these statements, it is faster to write this down compared to write the full statement down. So this is why it's important to understand the idea of when do we use the symbol and what does each of those statements represent. So that's the idea of conjunction. Whenever we combine two statements together using the word and. There's another type of compound statement that we need to define, and that is a disjunction statement. A disjunction statement, it's when we combine two statements but now using the word or. And we have a symbol for that as well. The symbol that we'll be using for this is kind of like a lower hand arrow. So using that same idea that we have defined previously, notice that if we let P to represent Inez plays the flute, and we let Q represent Sue plays the cello, then let's write down how would the compound or the disjunction statement for those two statements will look like. Well, the disjunction statement will look like as Inez plays the flute or Sue plays the cello. But now that we have introduced these symbols, again, if we let P represent the statement Inez plays the flute, we can represent that as P. And now knowing that or, we have a symbol for that, which is a downside arrow, and we let Q represent Sue plays the cello, then notice that this is a symbolic way of stating the same. Instead of saying Inez plays the flute or Sue plays the cello, we can say P or Q, where P represents Inez plays the flute and Q represents Sue plays the cello. So a disjunction statement is when we combine two statements using the word or. And the last idea that we'll be discussing today is this idea of a negation. What does it mean for us to negate a statement? Well, it's pretty self-explanatory. Whenever you are given a statement, the negation is the opposite meaning. And we do have a symbol for that. The symbol that we can use for a negation, it's just a squiggly line, somewhere like this. So here we are given two different statements. Let's try to negate them. And notice that we are not putting them together. We are just negating them. So what does the negation of Inés plays the flute will look like? Well, the negation for that is Inés does not play the flute. And notice that I'm using the word does not to negate it. Now, how will this statement look like using symbols? Well, since I know that P stands for Inés plays the flute, and now this statement Inés does not play the flute, it's a negation, then I can just represent this as not P. Let's try to define the negation of our second statement. Sue plays the cello. How would that look like? Well, in words, the negation for that statement will be Sue does not play the cello. And again, I'm using the word does not to indicate that it's a negation. But now, if we want to represent the same statement using symbols, then I can say squiggly line Q. Because again, Q represents the statement Sue plays the cello. Hello. If you would like to continue to learn about mathematics, you can check out the videos on the left.